I'm Lee Schneider. I'm the general counsel here at Ava Labs. We've got a great show for you today. We're going to be talking about proof of work versus proof of stake. I'm joined together with Stephen, our chief protocol architect, and two fantastic academics, Fahad and Kose. And we're going to be talking about a paper that Fahad and Kose co-authored with a third person, looking at the economics of proof of stake versus proof of work and trying to come to a conclusion about which one offered better security guarantees based on the economics of the two types of mechanisms. Now, often it's thought that proof of stake is a consensus mechanism and proof of work is a consensus mechanism. But as Dr. Emin Sirer, our founder and CEO, likes to say, actually, that's not quite accurate. It's more accurate to say proof of stake-based consensus mechanism and proof of work-based consensus mechanism, because proof of stake and proof of work are just one part of how the consensus mechanism and validation on a blockchain works. So it's important to keep that in mind, but nevertheless, both proof of stake and proof of work are very important parts of how the consensus mechanism works. And so they are key to understanding a lot of the security that goes into a blockchain network. Just as a quick aside, for those of you who are following what's happening on Capitol Hill, today there's a markup, a joint committee markup, House Financial Services and House Agriculture Committee on the Clarity Act, which is commonly known as the Market Structure Bill. So there's a whole bunch of things going on Capitol Hill that will potentially have implications for all of us, particularly in the US. So we watch that with great interest, and you can follow along in a variety of places, including our Owl Explains website and LinkedIn and X. I was about to say Twitter, but that's because I'm an old guy. Anyway, let's jump right into it. So, Kose, Fahad, tell us a little bit about the paper. Talk a little bit about how you came up with the idea to write the paper, and then what you set out to do and what some of the conclusions were.
Yeah, all right. Thank you, first of all, for having us. Now, let me just dive right into why we wrote, we were thinking about writing the paper. Is I think that there is this folk belief that proof of work is a more secure Sybil resistance mechanism than proof of stake. And the truth is, if you think about it from an economic perspective, it starts to become clear that that's not the case. So let me maybe just like tee it up a bit in the way that, like, I mean, everything sort of goes back to the Genesis paper and I guess Bitcoin's Genesis block. With in that paper, essentially Nakamoto is saying, like, we have to have some kind of Sybil resistance mechanism. We have to have a way so that you can't just like be a billion people in this system and have essentially unlimited power based on like creating more and more identities. So hey, why don't we use this concept, a spam fighting protocol from the early 90s of all things, that was, I think, named in the late 90s, actually, proof of work. But it was a spam fighting protocol, right? And so the idea was, well, you don't just get a vote in this system by having an identity. No. You have to solve this stupid computational puzzle. And so, your ability to sort of solve the puzzle fast became your way of weighing into the system. And so what it really meant is you have to have a lot of computational power relative to the rest of the network to be able to kind of control what's going on. And that is and so I think the intuition a lot of people then have is like, okay, so this system brought in this cost to take control of the system, and therefore it is secure. But so even if you start to bring a little bit of economics into it, you start to realize that's not exactly correct. And what I mean by that is, in fact, here, let me offer it this way. If you think about the security of the Bitcoin blockchain back in the year 2009, I think it's fair to say it wasn't all that secure because there weren't very many people mining on the Bitcoin blockchain. So the truth is that, like, if a large actor just wanted to start double spending like crazy or run a denial of service, it wouldn't have been very expensive, which kind of gets to the point about, like, it's not so much about oh, we're imposing a cost for you to have a say in the system. It's how costly is it for me to have a say in the system? And the answer is it's only as costly as there are other good players that are also playing that game, right? So in other words, if nobody is mining, then it's trivial for me to sort of take control of that chain. Whereas if a ton of people are mining, then it's going to be really hard. But this is a more general concept for really any Sybil resistance mechanism, which is, at the end of the day, even in the proof of work setting, it's not like the issue is literally solving the mathematical problems by hand. You have a computer doing it. The real sort of hurdle is an economic hurdle, which is you're going to have to go buy this specialized hardware. And at the end of the day, how much cash are you willing to put into doing this, right? It's actually an economic and a financial cost. And so then when you put it in that context, you get like a clearer comparative aspect here, which is like, okay, so in proof of stake, there's not a mathematical problem that you're trying to find the solution to, but there is capital that is securing the system, right? So proof of stake is essentially a lottery system. But the point is, if there are a lot of lottery tickets and I have a few, I'm very unlikely to be selected. So it's kind of like, well, what is the cost of a lottery ticket, or what is the cost of having a large share of lottery tickets? And so the real question then becomes not, is there a cost or not? It's not a binary thing. It's what is the cost of taking control of the system? And again, really what you have to think about there is that your cost of taking control of the system is related to how much capital outside of you is going into securing the system. So in proof of work, that capital is all the hardware that all of the miners have basically purchased and are putting to use. In proof of stake, it is the stake capital, right? And so what we're really doing here is in econ speak, we're endogenizing the capital that is brought forth into the system. We're not just taking it as given. We're saying like, look, given that these systems are designed in a certain way, what should you expect is the amount of economic value that is put in to buying these mining chips in the proof of work setting, as contrasted with the amount of economic capital that is put into staking capital in a proof of stake system. And what we basically find is that proof of stake has an advantage here. Now, where does that advantage come from? Well, essentially, it actually comes from sort of the very first thing people think about when they compare proof of work and proof of stake, which is that massive environmental cost of proof of work. Now, the point though here is that we're not making a political statement about the environment or anything here. Our point actually is that environmental cost turns out to be significant if you care about blockchain security, right? So you don't have to, this is not about like externalities of environmental pollution. Not that that's not a thing, but the point is like that we're saying like, irrespective of your views on that, the point is that environmental cost actually has an implication on the security of the system, which is the thing that favors proof of stake. So how exactly does that work? Well, essentially the cost that we're describing, the environmental cost, it's borne by somebody. And it turns out it's borne by the miners. And there's a really easy way to see this, which is mining hardware depreciates. It actually depreciates quite a lot. That actually is the deadweight loss, right? Like when you think about all the quotes you hear about the amount of energy that Bitcoin burns, well, where's the burning of the energy coming from? Like it's not magic. It's that there's mining chips that are running like crazy, right? And that is what's depreciating the mining chips. But who's footing the bill for that is the miners. And the thing is, miners are not altruistic people. Some of them maybe, they deeply believe to their bones about, Bitcoin or whatever, right? But most of them at this point are economic actors. And so they're doing a sort of, they're thinking about the return they're getting, and they're thinking about the investment capital they're willing to put in, given them the return that they're getting. And so the point is, in the proof of work system, they know they're going to face this deadweight loss. And they may not call it a deadweight loss. They may not think about it the way an economist does, but they understand it because they know their mining equipment is depreciating and they have to replace that mining equipment, right? They understand that and they internalize that. And that causes them to invest less than if they were in a proof of stake system where they don't have to bear that cost, right? But then the consequence of that is that all things equal, in a proof of work system, you have less investment capital securing the system than a proof of stake system. That is, you have the total value of a build attack, a 51% build attack on a proof of work chain is going to be lower than an all else equal proof of stake chain, precisely because in the former case, they're facing this depreciation and they internalize it. And so they're not going to invest as much because they understand that they're going to take that hit and they need to be paid back for it. And so as a consequence, it turns out that if you actually like think more than just, oh, there is a cost or is not a cost, and you think through what is the cost, that proof of stake actually turns out to be more secure than proof of work, at least when you're comparing identical chains.
So Fahad, going back to the environmental impact and not speaking about it in terms of environmental impact, but rather speaking about it in terms of electricity burned, right? So I would have thought, at least at a high level, that it's the combination for the miner on Bitcoin, it's the combination of the cost of the hardware and the cost of the electricity that creates the better Sybil resistance. It sounds like what you're saying, though, is the cost of the electricity is not part of the calculus there. Is that right?
No, okay. So I'm doing something that sometimes we academics do, which is expository, essentially. I'm simplifying to make a conceptual point. Yeah. The cost of electricity is also relevant. In fact, you can think of that as like 100% depreciation, right? Basically, what I mean is like,
yeah, it's gone immediately as soon as you use the electricity.
Exactly, right? So for instance, in our paper, they're both there, but it's a bit easier for exposition for me to focus on one. And I feel I don't know how you feel, but I feel like people really get it when I say like your mining chips are depreciating, but maybe equally they'd get it if I focus on the energy.
Right. I think both of them are part of the. One way to think about it very simply is it is sort of the cost of capital, the cumulative cost of capital. So the electricity costs are part of it. The depreciation of the mining equipment is part of it. And so yes, so I think it is important, and it increases the cost of capital and it decreases the capital on the ground, which is what Fahad was saying.
Right.
So yeah, altogether it makes the exactly yeah.
Yeah, no, I felt like throughout the whole paper it was very fair to like proof of work, actually, like in some cases maybe even like overly fair, like as a more practical like
we have to, because we have to get it published, So
well, yeah. But yeah, like as an example, I know reading about instances where like if Bitcoin is down, that of course reduces the
we were very even-handed. Yeah.
And so that can cause you to actually just shut off mining if the cost of electricity is higher than the actual reward you're getting. So like there's even kind of like further instances where like you can kind of get into like spirals and very interesting things like that.
That's also, right. This argument holds even after you find the cheapest electricity and so on. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. It also focuses a lot on like 51% for proof of work versus like say 33% or some mix in proof of stake. But like for proof of work, there are attacks that can reduce past the 51%. So there's things like selfish mining and things like that cause the virtuous people to get split on multiple chains. And in proof of stake, like if you wanted to use a synchronous protocol, you could have a proof of stake protocol with, up to 51% resilience as well. So this paper is the conclusions say that like proof of stake is more secure, but like, if you can also pile on additional kind of things pro proof of stake as well. So this is a very fair paper with respect to proof of work. And you could like really start piling on more if you wanted to.
Stephen, let me peel the curtain back a little bit here, because this gets into a little bit of what Kose was alluding to, which is the peer review process. So I think the truth of the matter is that people like Stephen, like people like yourself are very, very aware of what's going on the ground day to day and sort of the very current view of what's going on. That is not true in mainstream circles, but more importantly, it's also not really true in academic circles. So to be honest, like when we first started the process, when we first submitted this to a journal, the sort of the instantaneous reaction of reviewers is like, no, wait, what are you talking about? Like, I mean, we already know proof of work is the best thing ever, right? Like, I mean, it can't possibly be true that proof of work is not the best thing. And so, for instance, like literally in the peer review process, the reviewers were kind of saying things like, yeah, I just, it all looks right, but I don't feel it in my bones. There must be something here that you're not telling us. There must be something. And so precisely like Stephen was alluding to this fact that like we're essentially, so there's sort of you kind of have to think about attack vectors to like think of the problem fully, right? And you got to ask like, what are the different attack vectors on these different systems? And essentially what it kind of forced us to do was to be a little stilted on the attack vectors, being like, okay, because you see the argument that we just discussed is actually super general. Like if you're fixing, for instance, like a 51% attack, then it's always going to favor proof of stake, right? Because of the deadweight loss, because that's the difference, right? But one way you can kind of get around this when the referee's like, no, come on, I really feel it in my bones. Like proof of work must be better than this, is you play with the attack vectors. You're like, okay, so maybe you can take out a proof of stake chain with 33% plus epsilon, and you need a 51% for a proof of work chain, right? But no, I mean, I think that, so if you're fixing the attack vectors, then proof of stake is going to be more secure.
So I'd like to go back to the point that you started with, Fahad, and it echoed the point that I made at the very beginning about how proof of work and proof of stake are not themselves the entirety of the consensus protocol, but you called it the Sybil resistant part of the protocol. There are other pieces, obviously, to the consensus mechanism. Are those other pieces also designed to try to create the right conditions for greater security? Or is it really that if somebody can hit the Sybil resistance and break that you've automatically got an unsecure chain?
No, so I think the details of the other part of the consensus protocol is relevant, in part because it does actually ultimately affect the incentives for the Sybil resistant part of the mechanism, right? So actually, Kose and I have a paper or I guess it's an entry in the Oxford Research Encyclopedia that's about crypto economics, and it tries to explain this point, because I think, again, like, you guys are at the frontier of this stuff, so you know all the details, but it's not true even for academics, right? And so part of the point of that article was like, hey, I know we talk about proof of work and proof of stake as kind of all the entirety of the consensus protocol, but it's not really true. And I think one way to tee it up is to say that there's if you think about any decision-making process, right? Like, let's abstract for a moment. Any decision, like, Lee, you were talking about Congress. Let's talk about Congress for a moment here, right? How do you get a law, right? Well, the first thing is you need people who are part of the sort of, let's call it, decision committee. That is, you need members of Congress, right? We have to find a way to select them, right? That's the Sybil resistance mechanism part, right? Like, elections are a Sybil resistant mechanism. You got to spend a lot of money to kind of, whatever. But the point is, even if I tell you, look, here are the 435 members of the House of Representatives, and here is a bill, and here is how they're going to vote on it. I can even tell you, like, all these guys, this is their views on it. That doesn't tell you whether the bill passes or not, right? Because, for instance, in theory, I'm not talking specifically about Congress right now, but in theory, you could have things like a majority rule, you could have like a 2/3 rule, and you can, of course, have much more complicated things, right? Like the Avalanche protocol is I would say more complicated than something as simple as like a majority rule or a 2/3 rule or anything like that. And we don't need to go into that. But the point that I'm making is that there is a whole complexity that you can bring to the system after you've set the players who have some say in what's going on. But whatever you determine about that is going to affect the incentives of who wants to participate in the system, right? Like, if you tell me, hey, I can run for Congress, but if I am seated, I don't get a vote. It's like, okay, well, maybe I don't want to spend all my time running for Congress now. Whereas if you tell me, no, if you're seated, you get to be dictator. The other 434 don't matter. You're king of the world. Then maybe I want to run for it, right? So there are important implications there, but I think this is actually one area where we need a bit more research to properly understand, for instance, the distinctions between sort of heaviest chain rules, which a lot of other chains use, versus, for instance, the Avalanche protocol, which is a bit more, I would say, innovative.
So, Stephen, jump in here a little bit more just from the practical standpoint. Like, when you think of consensus, and in particular proof of stake for the Avalanche protocol,
Mhm.
what are some of the key factors that you think about?
Yeah, I mean, so for consensus, I think there's a lot of different properties of consensus. So, every new consensus research paper that comes out, it has oftentimes a new property that like maybe people didn't care of before, and then that's and so the kind of core properties of consensus is what is your fault tolerance? So like your 33%, 55, your 50%, 25%. There's kind of all these different percentages that you can come into. But also like how much latency does that incur? Like how many round trips of like messages? How large of a network can it scale to? So a lot of proof of stake protocols require multiple broadcasts. So a broadcast is like sending a message from one validator to all other validators. Like if you have a bunch of those in your protocol, then the message complexity starts getting very large if your validator set gets too large. So there's a lot of components like that you focus on the pure consensus side. But then a lot of proof of stake networks also care a lot about things like accountability and ensuring like, oh, if some block proposers say produces two conflicting blocks, maybe they want to get slashed, right? So there is a whole additional level on top of the kind of consensus, the just straight consensus side of incentives and accountability that some consensus protocols don't have like easy accountability. Some other protocols like very naturally do. So when you're mixing a consensus protocol in with like an incentive mechanism, like things that maybe a traditional consensus researcher wouldn't care about maybe become very critical. So yeah, there's a whole gamut of different factors that consensus protocols maybe solve. But for us, our most important things are latency, make sure that transactions get confirmed quickly, make sure that we can scale to a large number of validators. So that's very important to us going back to the early days. And yeah, so those are kind of like some very core things that specifically the Avalanche protocol was targeted towards, of having low latency and scaling to a very large number of people. Yeah.
So Kose and Fahad, when you all were thinking about writing the paper, did you have a preconceived notion as to what you would find when you actually did the analysis and the math?
I think we had some we had an intuition, a course argument that this point that Fahad made earlier in terms of the sort of increased cost of capital, that's a very simple finance argument, but it's very powerful. So we kind of thought this was going to be a central part of the argument, especially in real world situations. In fact, one of the hurdles we had to go through to convince the referees, we had two referees and the editor, was that in many real life situations, this is a very powerful argument that there is the additional cost of capital that's going to reduce the overall capital on the good side. So the malicious attacker then can take advantage of that in the case of proof of work. So that kind of intuition we had, and we just had to kind of pare it down into a nice model where people think all things have been considered. As you know, in economic models, we have to get into a lot of regions where it might not be, where the argument really makes a big difference, but we have to kind of convince the reader that we have considered all the various things, kind of thing. So I think in the end, there was a time when we were worried whether the editor and the referees are going to sign off on it. And I think what we had to say was our argument really does carry the day for real life parameters. That is, where you mentioned the cost of electricity. So in other words, so even if you find the best low costing environment for electricity, or even though you find the best equipment in terms of its attrition in value, even if you do all that in the real world, this argument is going to be compelling, So I think that was what carried the day in the end, and I think we will have impact because people cannot ignore the arguments we made. You know what I mean? So yeah, and
if I
Fahad, you
can
can
add,
add. Yeah.
if I can add to that a bit. So in some sense, Lee, it depends on kind of what stage you're talking about. I mean, the nice thing about working on stuff that you genuinely find interesting is that these things kind of come out organically. And what I mean by that is one of the luxuries of being an academic, for instance, is that you have the ability to just kind of get into arguments that you think may not be useful, but might actually turn out to be very useful in the sense that, like, I'll be talking to somebody and they'll say something. I'll be like, yeah, I'm not sure that's true. And then, for whatever reason on that day, I feel like pushing and going like, no, like, did you just say that? Or like, do you have a real argument? And they give you some kind of like hand wave. You're like, no, I think you're assuming something there or whatever. And like, you can even push them like, I bet you couldn't prove it. I bet you couldn't write some math to support that, right? And so I think this thing about proof of work security and sort of somehow it being like this omnipotent civil resistance mechanism was probably something that was kind of like slightly grating on me for a while. And at first, when you first hear, like, all right, fine, whatever. But like you keep on hearing it again and again. I was like, no, I bet there's something in there. I bet there's something that you're overlooking. And so I would say initially it's kind of a thing where, at least me personally, I didn't have a thought on, like, a big part about being a researcher is you have to find a way to translate reality into math. And until you are able to kind of do that step, you can't think very precisely. You just might have like open-ended skepticism. Like, oh, I know these people keep saying this thing. I don't know why it's true or why it's not. I'm not sure I care yet or whatever, right? But so initially it was like that type of thing. Like, people are saying this. I kind of have a sense of why they're saying it, but I don't know if I totally believe it. And then they keep saying it and keep saying it. At some point you're like, no, okay, wait, no, you can't keep on saying this. You have to actually give me an argument. And then actually sometimes what happens is, like, when other people, so like sometimes you play devil's advocate as an academic. You're like, okay, you keep saying this. And I asked you why it's true and you can't quite get there, but wait a minute, maybe I can distill what I think you mean into an argument and then I can study it. Right. And so that's the real piece. Like, a lot of times that's actually what happens, particularly when you're talking to, practitioners and so on, is like they don't want to, write out a whole bunch of math or anything, but they might have some intuition, but their intuition sometimes is really good and sometimes it's not that good. And the only way you can kind of get there is you ultimately sort of in a good faith effort try to distill their best argument into math and then study it in that context. And so I think once it sort of came down to like the precise math, it became, as Kose was saying, kind of obvious, right? Because the principles we're relying on are like foundational principles in finance. But seeing it is kind of, in some sense, the challenge.
So with the formula that you came up with, would it be usable to compare different types of or different implementations of proof of stake against each other? Or is it really just proof of work versus proof of stake?
So it would be possible to think within, for instance, proof of stake based chains. This gets a bit to like the attack vector side of it, right? So essentially the way we're thinking about it is if you can get a sufficiently large share, and this relates to when Stephen was talking about 33 versus 50, which is we kind of tilted the playing field in proof of work's favor there, where we said like, we had technically we allowed for a general share, but the reviewers were insistent that we should, when we talk about it in terms of practical implementation, that we should interpret the relevant share for proof of stake as being 33 plus epsilon, and like for proof of work being 50 plus epsilon. But essentially the framework was abstracting from kind of, I was talking about majority rule, 2/3 rule, heaviest chain rule versus avalanche protocol and so on. We were abstracting from that, essentially saying a sufficient share rule. But you could essentially augment the analysis by saying, okay, it's not a sufficient share rule now. So the sufficient share rule obviously does capture like things like heavy exchange rules, but for instance, it doesn't capture the Avalanche protocol, and it's possible that sort of the innovation in the Avalanche protocol actually is an advantage here. But yeah, you absolutely could sort of refine the analysis by adding that piece and then studying across proof of stake based chains.
And I was even thinking about it more simply than that, which is different proof of stake chains have different stake requirements or stake minimums. So for example, on Ethereum, I think it's 32 ETH. On Avalanche, it's 2,000 AVAX. Now, obviously, the price of Ethereum and the price of Ether and the price of AVAX make a difference in that. But you know, at the base level, you do have different stake amounts, which are denominated in the native crypto, but can be converted into dollars or dollar values. Although those dollar values can fluctuate pretty good over the course of time. So I was sort of thinking about it even at that most simplest level.
Right. So I should say you cut out, or I cut out probably for like 30 seconds there or something. So I missed a piece of what you were saying. However, I think I can fill in the blank. So, you know, correct me if I'm completely way off in answering something orthogonal to what you said. But I think when it comes to sort of a minimum stake requirement, of course, there's staking pools, right? And so I'm not sure how binding that ends up being. We don't explicitly think about this in part because of the existence of staking pools and so on. But let me put it this way: I'd be surprised if, given staking pools, that the minimum staking amount plays a particularly large role when we're thinking about sort of security of these chains.
Stephen, talk some more.
So I see one question in the chat that we could bring up, which is interesting, which is how do we reconcile the theoretical security assumptions of proof of stake with the reality of wealth concentration? So if a small number of validators control the majority of stake, how does this create, or does this create systemic vulnerabilities that make proof of stake less secure than distributed mining pools we see in mature proof of work networks? I definitely have opinions here, but I'll cede to the economists first, and then.
Yes. Okay. So I have a few thoughts there. So maybe the first one I'll just sort of take directly the question. So there's the obvious point about if you have a large share of any enterprise, it is probably not your incentive to burn it to the ground. So, you know, I think when we think about things like wealth concentration, this frankly distinguishes a little bit the way computer scientists sometimes think about things and the way economists think about things, which is like a lot of times computer scientists use this model of the world where they think of, I think in economics, what we refer to as like unbounded attackers. And so the question just becomes like, can this guy burn this thing to the ground? It's like, okay, yeah, if he controls 99% of the wealth of the assets, then yeah, he can obviously, under any protocol, is going to be able to do some pretty damaging things. But from an economic perspective, you know, it's like, would you burn your house down if you didn't have any insurance on it? Like, it starts to become a very sort of hard argument, I think, to reconcile from an economic perspective. And you know, if you think about it in sort of the traditional context, we don't generally, in fact, in corporate finance, Kose can probably speak to this at more length, but in corporate finance, traditional corporate finance, it's not generally seen as a bad sign when the insiders have a large position. If anything, it's probably the opposite. It's like, wait, you know, if you really believe in this thing, why don't you have? Or in other words, like, if there isn't people who have this sort of concentration, like it's probably suggesting there is a problem there. Like you're just selling this off to, you know, people who don't know what they're doing. That's not to say that wealth concentration is good here, but my point is like the core of the economics is that you do have you typically in corporate finance, we think about the idea that you want to align incentives, and one way you align incentives is precisely that you provide people, for instance, a share of the firm going forward in one way or another. This is also related to like the executive compensation literature. That's one thing. Yeah.
One interesting thing to build on that as well is that if you burn a proof of stake network to the ground, you just burned your capital to the ground.
Right.
With a proof of work network, you can at least resell the hardware. Like maybe that's not true in Bitcoin. Like you have a double shot ASIC, right? That's basically only useful for Bitcoin. But like if you go to something like Ethereum pre-merge, they were using GPU hashes typically. Like you can resell your GPUs even if you've burned the network to the ground, right? So it's kind of, again, like a further disincentivization on proof of stake compared to proof of work.
Right. In fact, I should say that there are a couple of academic papers on this topic, including some of mine. And they also kind of, so for instance, like Stephen, the last thing you were alluding to is the specialization of the hardware in a proof of work network. And yeah, so for instance, like if you have a network where it's just GPUs and your hardware is repurposable, that's a serious problem, right? But yeah, you can't really repurpose your AVAX token after you've sort of completely made the Avalanche blockchain unusable. So it's kind of like an extreme case of the repurposability. And so I should say like that part of, that part of the literature has actually is relatively mature in the sense like even the papers I'm thinking of in that literature are several years old, like published a couple of years ago, and capture all these points. And so I fully agree with that. And then there is formal work on that. Let me lastly say though, because there's this reference to mature proof of work networks. Yeah, I'm not sure that, first, I guess I don't know which specific networks the person here is alluding to, but I'm not sure there's not, meaningful concentration in several of the large proof of work chains. Let me also separately say that I think one thing to think about is entry, right? Which is to say, that again, part of the point of like what Kose and I were talking about is that, okay, so I give you, let's say, a proof of work chain where it's, let's say, super decentralized in terms of the mining power. Let's say we know for a fact that there's not a single miner who owns more than 1% of it, but the cost of a 51% build attack is $5. Is that secure? Right? It's not so much about like the concentration amongst the current players. It's about like, can somebody just show up and become 99% of the network, right? And that's about the cost of the whole thing. So in that sense, I also think about some of these thoughts about like decentralized validation as being a little second order in that way.
So I want to follow up on that point, Fahad, because a lot of the conversation often in the U.S. and in particular in Washington, D.C., seems to favor pursuit of quote unquote decentralization. We can talk about what that means another time. Let's not try to define that for the moment. But, one of the things that you seem to be saying is that, well, actually, you don't need a super highly distributed network. Let's use the term distributed instead of decentralized from an economic standpoint in order to make sure that the incentives are there for quote unquote good actors.
Right. So I think we have to be careful about kind of like what the objectives are, right? So I think, for instance, the point about like single point of failure is something that requires a distributed network, right? Like, but that's also detached from sort of the conversation we've been having, which has sort of been about something else. And I think, and the truth is, like, I think the discussion usually that people are having, because I think the single point of failure thing is a bit more of a, if you really dig into it, it's more of a technical point. Like you go to the CS literature, like, before like Nakamoto blockchain style, like the Haber Stornetta and even just like Byzantine fault tolerance going back to the 80s, right? Like that's touching on some of that stuff, and it's important stuff. But the truth is, like, let's be honest, when Congress is talking about it, they don't know Lamport, Peace, and Showstack. Okay, like they're talking at a higher level, And usually they're thinking more about sort of, let's say, the economic efficiencies and so on. And in that context, yeah, the truth is, like, in that context, it's not really the distribution, the distributed nature of the system that's important. It's about the permissionlessness of the system. Right. And in the context of like traditional economics, there's another word that we use in like intro econ classes, right? Which is free entry, right? Perfect competition, right? If you've ever taken an intro econ class, you probably studied the perfect competition case, you probably studied the monopolist case, and you probably studied the intermediate case with like N firms. And very easily you can show that in perfect competition, basically the incumbents are not able to extract any rents because they're competing with each other, and so the value goes all to sort of the consumer side, whereas a monopolist is fully able to extract rents, and then oligopolists. And so you can imagine a perfectly competitive setting where there is one or two players that are actually just providing the services. The question is just, how do we trust them to not extract the rents? And the answer is, if they misbehave even a little bit and they immediately lose their market share, that's fine. And that's perfect competition, right? And so that is, I think, something that deserves more focus, frankly, from the debate in DC, which I think seems to be lost. There is this conflation of like the word decentralization with the word permissionless. And sometimes it's further conflated with the word public, right? So public is read access, open read access. Permissionless is open write access. And I think that's the really, really important thing. And then decentralization, frankly, when most people use it, they don't even really have a meaning for it, because you can talk about decentralization of users, of validators, of, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, and when I talk about decentralization, I focus on it at the very technical level. And part of my definition is no single point of failure, because I think that is an incredibly important part from a technical standpoint. That's what we should care about. We should care about no single point of failure. We should care about no single source of truth. We should care about no central authority that can change the data, without the consensus mechanism functioning. And so that's the way that I think about it. But, to your point, Fahad, the discussions about decentralization are many and varied, if I can put it politely. And, sometimes the focus is on other things like governance issues that, may have relevance to the core technical decentralization, but probably often are not that relevant to the core technical decentralization. Is there some literature that you have on this point that you could share with me? Because anyway, we'll take it offline. I know we're live streaming right now.
I always have literature that I can share with you. So okay. Some of it may be Kose in my work, though.
That's okay. As I'm fond of telling my wife, when I tell her she's beautiful and she tells me I'm biased, I say, just because I'm biased doesn't mean I'm wrong. So that's okay. If you're biased, I'll take your stuff too. It doesn't mean you're wrong.
Exactly.
Well, listen, this has been a really good conversation, really interesting. I just want to give each of you the chance to make some final wrap-up comments. Stephen, you want to go first?
Yeah, so one last thing that I just wanted to kind of shout out is talking about like the security of proof of work versus proof of stake. There's a lot of like academic conversations that we can have, right? But it's also good to like look in practice, right? And I think way back to like, say 2012, 2014, like there were a lot of instances of like proof of work, like 51% attacks happening, say like ETH Classic having a 51% attack, having say like, Bitcoin, I don't know, whatever, Satoshi's vision, whatever. Like there were many instances of these kind of like 51% attacks going back in the past, just because honestly, proof of work is a lot less popular now outside of Bitcoin. But I don't know of any like instance that a proof of stake network has actually been attacked by its validator set. So like, maybe feel free to correct me if I'm wrong. Maybe someone can have a counterpoint. But like, it kind of aligns with the theoretical results as well that we see in practice, is that yes, these proof of stake networks are also like more secure in practice. They see significantly less reorgs. They see significantly less attacks by their participants. And it's just because, you know, in a mining world, like you kind of only put up that cost for some short period of time to attack the network. Whereas in proof of stake, you have this kind of like huge amount of capital at risk to attacking. So at least from what I know and what I've seen, like the in practice, it aligns with the theoretical results of this paper, and that's always nice to see. So feel free to shout out any time a like mass attack has happened on a proof of stake network, but I'm not aware of any.
So let me sort of briefly say that you know, the results of the paper don't say that proof of stake is unconditionally secure. And proof of work is not unconditionally secure too, which I think is actually kind of an important point, particularly for policymakers right now, because I feel like they tend to kind of think of it as a binary. And this relates to a bit of kind of how this project again sort of came about, which is like people insisting that Bitcoin is like unconditionally perfectly secure, which, you know, even without knowing anything, it's very hard to like believe a statement like that, right? Like, it's like, here's this thing, it's perfect, and you cannot do anything to harm it, right? Like, I don't know, even if we don't describe exactly what we're talking about, you're already kind of like, well, is that plausible? But then related to that, let me say, so, you know, I agree with, like, I think everything Stephen was saying there, and one thing that I think is also sort of important associated with that is I do think the points here have like a very important relevance to the debate that's going on in DC. And I don't think it's always kind of fully felt. So for instance, let me just maybe draw that out a bit. There are members of Congress who like to basically attack crypto on the premise that it burns a lot of energy. But, you know, actually, I think even those parts of Congress are in some sense part of the problem. And what I mean by that is that, look, again, the context that, you know, Stephen and Lee, that you guys have is very current because you're in it and everything. But as you all know, the mainstream context is very, very much dated. And so there's this sort of education process that needs to happen. But if your senator is acting like Bitcoin is the only blockchain and every other blockchain that might conceivably exist is a proof of work chain, and they're all horrible because of their insane amount of environmental expenditure, I mean, that's on the one hand, that's all false. But, you know, the kind of the more important point that I'm making is it's also sort of accelerating the problem that particular senator or that those few members of Congress are anyway thinking of, which is to say, like, I think, you know, and you guys know this better than anybody probably, is like a big thing that sort of drives the crypto space forward is new intellectual capital, separate from financial capital, intellectual capital, right? And so the narratives do affect kind of like what people are working on and so on, right? And if you're going to paint the entire space as being all proof of work all of the time, yeah, proof of work has a lot of drawbacks. That's part of the point that we're making, right? And so that's not really helping the conversation. And in fact, if you sort of flip it and think about it from the other perspective, right? Like we've seen a huge shift, even sort of empirically, in terms of sort of the proportion of chains that are proof of stake based relative to proof of work based, right? So I think like maybe just if, you know, it was 2019 or 2021, somewhere around there, I think there was more proof of stake chains that were launched than proof of work chains, which was a huge shift from what we'd seen, say, 10 years ago. And if you don't shine a light on that, and you instead, in fact, pretend that the opposite is true, and you also pretend that proof of work chains are like infinitely secure, you're basically drawing the audience into what you anyway think is a problem, and then complaining that it's a problem. Right. Which is really counterproductive. I mean, so as an academic, I'm offended because it's basically false premises in the first place. Like it's counterfactual. But like I'm saying, even as a politician, right? Unless you're the most cynical person in the world, what is the advantage to going, this sucks, but this is the best thing also in some way because it's like super secure and whatever, right? And so you're kind of amplifying the problem that you're highlighting, and again, it's not even true, right? Like so, in the sense that like the advantages that you're conferring on it are not actually there. So I think there is value in sort of properly understanding that the truth of the matter is Bitcoin is a legacy system, right? Its advantage comes from the fact that it was the first and therefore ended up with like much more adoption than the other chains. But the truth of the matter is, like, I would say every other relevant chain that I can think of is not a proof of work chain. I'm sorry, I don't consider Doge to be a relevant chain. But the other chains have moved on and are more innovative and are using a more efficient Sybil resistance mechanism, which is proof of stake. But if it's going to be misframed by some of our leaders on the Hill, you're not helping anything.
So, Kose, you get the last word.
Okay, I don't have a lot to say, but I think Lee has sort of you alluded to it at some point, which is, are there? So this is a very important question in thinking about the future, where you have CFI kind of handling things, which is now under the umbrella of TradFi. So there are lots of issues, and security of the protocols is totally important. So I'm thinking there are more protocols, more questions to be asked, and more issues to be brought into thinking about the security of these systems. I think that's going to be a central issue. So I'm optimistic we are going to get a lot of attention on this kind of work that we are talking about today. I think it's crucially important. So, more than taking sides here, I'm just saying, these are central issues in the field. So
I think you're 100% right, Kose. Well, listen, I want to thank all of you for joining us today. I think this was a super interesting conversation. I learned a lot, but that's one of the great things about being in blockchain and crypto is I'm always learning a lot. But Stephen, thank you for joining me here, and Fahad and Kose, it's great to see you, and really important paper. Just so you know, Owl Explained cited your paper in its comment letter to the SEC Crypto Task Force, and we're in the midst of writing a comment letter to the FCA in England, in the United Kingdom, and we're citing your paper in there as well. So hopefully we'll get the word out, and people will watch this live stream, and you'll be inundated with questions and requests for more information.
Thank you, Lee. Thank you for doing this. It's fantastic. It's great. Yeah.
Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks to all of our folks who joined us. It's good stuff.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.